We are counting down the 10 deadliest locomotives ever to run the rails, ranked not just by tragic death tolls, but by the lethal design flaws and ignored warnings that turned progress into catastrophe. From pioneering steam engines with explosive secrets to high-speed racers and war machines whose flaws claimed hundreds, each entry reveals how ambition, cost-cutting, and human error left disaster in their wake. Which locomotive tops this list as the ultimate killer? Let us begin with number 10. In July 1815, crowds gathered at New Bottle Colliery in County Durham to witness the promise of steam power. William Brunton's mechanical traveler, an experimental locomotive with a pair of mechanical legs, was about to demonstrate its strength. As the boiler built pressure, excitement turned to horror. The safety valves meant to release excess steam had been screwed down too tightly. With nowhere for the pressure to escape, the boiler ruptured violently. Scalding steam and metal fragments tore through the assembled spectators. 13 people died instantly, and dozens more were injured. No inquiry followed. Early steam locomotives offered no real protection, no regulation, no standardized safety features, just raw, unchecked force. Brunton's design faded into history, but the lesson remained. In the race for progress, even a single overlooked valve could turn innovation into tragedy. On December 29, 1876, the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern passenger train approached the iron bridge over the Ashtabula River in northern Ohio. Snow weighed down the truss, but the train pressed on, packed with holiday travelers. As the locomotive reached the center span, the bridge gave way beneath its weight. 11 cars plunged into the frozen river below, shattering on impact. Within moments, overturned oil lamps ignited the wooden coaches. Flames swept through the wreckage, trapping passengers inside. The nearest hospital lay miles away, and rescue efforts struggled in the bitter cold. Official reports listed 92 dead, but some historians believe the toll reached as high as 200, with many bodies lost to fire and water. Survivor accounts describe chaos and helplessness as the fire consumed the cars, creating an inferno. The Ashtabula disaster exposed a deadly combination: under-engineered bridges, unable to bear locomotive loads, and flammable coach designs that turned a structural failure into a mass casualty catastrophe. In the early hours of March 18, 1912, Southern Pacific Locomotive No. 704 stood cold in the San Antonio yard, its crew under pressure to prepare for the next shift. After a recent wreck, the boiler had been hastily repaired, but lingering doubts about its integrity were brushed aside. As the firemen rushed to raise steam, water levels dropped dangerously low. The crown sheet, the metal plate above the firebox, overheated in seconds. Suddenly, the reinforcing bars gave way. A deafening explosion tore the boiler apart, hurling the multi-ton front cylinder high into the air. Chunks of steel, some no bigger than a suitcase, rained down across the yard. The oil tender landed 150 feet away, igniting a fire that burned through the wreckage. Several workers died instantly. Others were pulled from the debris, battered, and burned. Witnesses described the ground shaking and a cloud of steam and coal dust filling the dawn. Official reports never settled on an exact death toll, but the violence of the blast left no doubt. Under pressure, even a routine maintenance job could turn a locomotive into a fragmentation bomb. On the evening of November 1, 1918, a Brooklyn Rapid Transit subway train raced toward the Malbone Street Tunnel, carrying hundreds of commuters through the city's underground. At the controls sat Edward Luciano, a dispatcher pressed into service as a motorman during a crippling strike. He had no real experience driving trains, but the company needed to keep service running at all costs. As the train approached a sharp curve near Prospect Park, Luciano accelerated to nearly 40 miles per hour, 5 times the posted limit for that section. The wooden cars lurched and screeched, then derailed, splintering against the tunnel walls. In seconds, 3 coaches crumpled into a tangled heap of metal and shattered glass. Passengers were thrown from their seats, pinned by debris, or trapped behind inward opening doors that jammed shut under the crush. Survivors later recalled the silence after the crash, broken only by cries for help echoing in the darkness. The official death toll reached at least 93, with some estimates topping 100. The Public Service Commission's report blamed not just Luciano's inexperience, but also the lethal mismatch between human error and a design that left no margin for mistakes. In the aftermath, the city faced hard questions about operator pressure, safety standards, and the real cost of keeping trains on schedule. On January 13, 1917, a crowded train rolled toward Ciurea station in Romania, packed with soldiers and civilians escaping the Eastern Front. Wartime chaos had overloaded the line, with hundreds crammed into every carriage and more clinging to the roofs and steps. As the train descended a steep grade, the brakes, already strained by the sheer weight, began to fail. The engineer tried desperately to slow the runaway cars, but the system couldn't hold. At the bottom of the slope, the train slammed into a string of fuel wagons left on a siding. The collision tore open the tankers, and a firestorm swept through the wreck. Flames engulfed the wooden coaches, trapping passengers inside. Survivors later described the night as a wall of heat and screams, with rescue nearly impossible. Censorship and wartime confusion shrouded the true scale of the disaster. Romanian press accounts and later historians estimate between 600 and 1,000 dead, but no official inquiry was ever held. The Ciurea catastrophe stands as one of the deadliest rail accidents in history, a tragedy born from overloaded trains, neglected brakes, and the secrecy of war. On the night of November 5, 1967, a British rail passenger train powered by a Class 47 diesel locomotive thundered toward London. Just past Hither Green, the ride turned deadly in seconds. At 70 miles per hour, the third coach struck a wedge-shaped fragment of steel that had broken away from a fatigued section of rail. The train continued for nearly a mile before the derailed wheels hit a complex crossing. In a violent chain reaction, 11 of 12 carriages left the tracks, 4 overturning and crushing passengers inside. 49 people died, making it one of Britain's worst peacetime rail disasters. The Ministry of Transport investigation traced the cause to a fatigue crack that had spread through a bolt hole at a rail joint. Maintenance records revealed a troubling pattern. A broken sleeper had been replaced with a shallower timber, poorly packed and resting on thin ballast. A rubber support pad was missing from the next concrete sleeper. Just 4 months earlier, speed limits for newer trains had been raised, but no one had checked if the track could withstand the heavier AXL loads. The inquiry found that inspection and engineering departments had allowed maintenance standards to slip, failing to assess the risks of faster, heavier trains on aging infrastructure. In the aftermath, British Rail rushed to introduce continuous welded rail, eliminating the joints where fatigue cracks could lurk unseen. Ultrasonic testing became mandatory, and inspection routines were overhauled. The Hither Green crash forced a reckoning, even in the modern diesel era, showing that neglecting the basics of track maintenance could turn a routine journey into a mass casualty event. In the darkness before dawn on March 3, 1944, a freight train led by Locomotive 8017 crawled into the Army tunnel near Balvano, Italy. Wartime shortages had forced Italian railways to burn low-grade coal, thick with impurities that produced dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. The train was overloaded, carrying hundreds of unauthorized passengers, refugees, black marketeers, and workers desperate to move through a country under occupation. As the engine labored up the tunnel's steep gradient, its exhaust filled the confined space. The train slowed, then stopped. With no ventilation and the locomotive's firebox still burning, a colorless, odorless gas crept through every carriage. Within minutes, passengers and crew alike began to lose consciousness. There was no warning, no sound of disaster. When rescuers finally entered the tunnel hours later, they found bodies slumped in their seats, some still clutching their belongings. Official reports listed around 520 dead, making it the deadliest railway disaster in Italian history. Investigators traced the cause to the poor quality of coal. Wartime memos had warned that impurities would increase carbon monoxide output, but there were no alternatives. The tunnel's design offered no escape for the fumes, and the stalled train became a sealed chamber. Unlike fiery wrecks or violent derailments, the Balvano tragedy unfolded in silence, its victims claimed by an invisible hazard. Only after the war did authorities begin to regulate tunnel ventilation and fuel standards. The legacy of Locomotive 8017 is a reminder that not all railway dangers roar or burn. Some drift quietly, hidden in the air itself. At midday, on January 3, 1944, the Galicia Mail Express hurtled down the steep grades of northern Spain, hours behind schedule and already in trouble. Brake problems had been flagged at Astorga, but with war crowding every timetable, the train pressed on after a brief inspection and the removal of one locomotive. By the time the express reached Albaris, the descent had become a runaway. The engineer applied every brake and sanded the rails, but the train could not slow. The station master at Albaris, hearing the frantic whistle, called ahead to Torre del Bierzo and warned that an uncontrolled train was coming. At Torre del Bierzo, desperate efforts were made to stop the express. Sleepers were thrown across the rails, but the heavy train smashed through and plunged into tunnel number 20. Inside, a shunting engine with 3 carriages was moving away from the station. The collision was immediate and violent. The wooden coaches, lit by gas, burst into flames. Within minutes, the tunnel filled with fire and smoke, trapping passengers and crew in the darkness. The disaster did not end with the first impact. The crash severed signaling cables, leaving the signals at the next tunnel set to clear. A coal train hauling 27 loaded wagons barreled into the wreckage, compounding the devastation. The resulting inferno burned for 2 days, making rescue nearly impossible. Many victims were never identified, their remains lost in the heat and confusion. Official figures listed 78 dead, but the true toll remains uncertain. Wartime censorship, missing records, and the sheer number of unregistered passengers have led some historians to estimate as many as 500 lives lost. For days, the tunnel was a sealed furnace, with rescuers forced to wait as the blaze consumed any hope of survival. The Torre del Bierzo disaster stands as a grim lesson in how technical failures, human decisions, and the limits of rescue inside confined spaces can turn a single lapse into a tragedy of staggering scale. In November 1977, the Deutsche Reichsbahn 011516 stood ready on the tracks outside Bitterfeld, East Germany. This was a modernized steam locomotive, built decades after the age of experimental engines and primitive safety valves. By then, engineers believed they had mastered the dangers of high-pressure boilers. Yet that morning, routine maintenance shortcuts and a single overlooked detail set the stage for disaster. As the locomotive crested a gentle downgrade, water inside the boiler sloshed away from the crown sheet, the metal plate forming the top of the firebox. The crown sheet, meant to be submerged and cooled by water, was left exposed to the full heat of the fire. Within minutes, temperatures soared above 1,000 degrees Celsius. Under normal conditions, special safety plugs made from low-melting alloys would have triggered, venting steam and warning the crew of danger. But weeks of hurried maintenance had left the inside of the boiler coated with a stubborn layer of limescale. The plugs, now encased in mineral buildup, never did their job. As the metal weakened, the crown sheet began to sag. Then came the final breach. Superheated water hit the glowing metal and instantly flashed into steam. The result was a violent water hammer, an explosive force that ripped the boiler from its mountings. Witnesses later described a deafening roar and a wall of scalding steam. The entire boiler assembly, weighing several tons, launched 40 meters down the track, landing with enough force to weld itself to the rails. The cab was shredded. Burning coal rained across the station platform. 9 people died on the spot, including crew and bystanders. 45 more suffered burns, broken bones, or shrapnel wounds. Forensic investigators combed through the wreckage. They traced the failure back to the scale-blocked safety plugs, a simple maintenance task missed in the rush to keep older locomotives running on tight schedules. Metallurgical analysis revealed the plugs had never reached their melting point, protected by a thick crust of lime. The safety systems had been bypassed not by design, but by neglect. In the aftermath, Bitterfeld Station became a case study in how even mature, well-understood technology can become deadly when routine checks are skipped. The 1977 explosion forced a new reckoning with maintenance protocols. But for the families of the 9 victims, the cost of that lesson had already been paid. On the night of December 12, 1917, a French troop train began its descent from Modane through the snow-covered Alps, packed with soldiers returning from the Italian front. The train was overloaded, with over 1,000 men crammed into wooden carriages, some standing shoulder to shoulder, others perched on luggage racks or huddled in the corridors. Wartime urgency had forced the military to press a single 460 steam locomotive into service, a machine never designed to haul such weight down a mountain pass. The descent from Modane to Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne was steep and treacherous, with grades reaching 3.3%. Railway engineers had warned that a train of this mass needed at least 2 locomotives and a full set of brakes on every car. But the second engine had been detached at Modane to save coal, and many of the carriages lacked continuous braking systems. Only the locomotive and the first few cars could be slowed by the engineer's hand. As the train gathered speed on the icy rails, the brakes began to overheat. The engineer fought desperately to control the descent, but the system was overwhelmed by the sheer mass behind him. Friction shoes glowed red, wood and metal shrieked, and the carriages shuddered with every curve. By the time the train reached the final stretch above Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne, it was traveling at nearly 100 kilometers per hour, twice the safe limit for the line. At 11:15 p.m., the train approached a tight curve near the station. The overloaded cars, straining against the couplings, began to derail. Wooden bodies splintered, ironwork twisted, and carriages piled up in a tangled heap. Many of the cars caught fire almost instantly, ignited by the hot brake shoes and scattered oil lamps. Soldiers trapped inside had no chance of escape as flames swept through the wreckage. The air filled with choking smoke and the sound of men calling for help. French Army records list at least 675 dead, but some estimates place the toll above 800. The true number remains uncertain. Many bodies were never identified, and the military censored reports to protect morale. Survivors later spoke of the silence that followed, a landscape of charred wood, twisted metal, and winter darkness. Only a handful of officers and railway workers dared to speak publicly about the disaster. No formal inquiry was ever held. Wartime secrecy and the urgent need to move troops meant that questions about design limits, brake capacity, and operational orders went unanswered. The Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne catastrophe stands as the deadliest locomotive-linked disaster on record. A tragedy born from a lethal mix of overloaded design, ignored warnings, and the relentless logic of war. For the families of the lost, there was neither justice nor explanation, only the memory of a train that never should have run and the silence that followed its last descent. Across all 10 entries, one truth stands out. Every deadly locomotive was a product of overlooked warnings and profit-driven shortcuts. The pattern is not about faulty machines, it is about human choices prioritizing speed and cost over lives. That legacy shapes rail travel even now, reminding us real progress demands vigilance, not just innovation. Which disaster changed your view most? Share your thoughts below.